In this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. And like you said, it's like really there's three zones. And we're just trying to like work within there like broadly so that we can try to target physiological adaptations.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by Dave Schell, founder and head coach of Kaizen Endurance, for another episode of Fast Physiology, where we do a succinct dive into a single endurance topic. In today's episode, we're going to explore the question, what field tests can you do to determine your training zones? Enjoy. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So today, Dave, I want to talk about field tests for zoning. And this spurs partially off our last question, partially off an Instagram post that I had, and partially off opinions that you have about max heart rate stuff. And something that I think that people continually get wrong is that they use things like max heart rate, and like worst case scenario, they're using like an age-based equation to determine their max heart rate, and then they just use their zones from there. Or they even do a test for their max heart rate, and then they use, percentages of that max heart rate for their zones.
Yeah.
Or people use just one test like FTP to determine all of their zones. And I think what's happening and what we're missing out on is kind of the nuances of why we measure zones and do zones in the first place. And I think there's really easy field tests that we can actually implement in order to get a good idea of what we actually need to do in order to get a decent idea of where our zones actually are.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I want to start with, what's the point of determining our zones? So from a research, physiological, lab-based testing perspective, we can really only determine three zones. This is why most of the literature reports a three-zone model. So you have, and those zones are based on three thresholds. Your first threshold, which is your zone 2, your fat max, your lactate threshold 1, ventilatory threshold 1, Neers breakpoint 1, which is telling us when we shift from baseline steady state physiology to something that is a little bit above that. That is kind of that's the first thing we're trying to detect. Then we have second threshold, otherwise known as FTP, critical speed, critical power, ventilatory threshold 2, lactate threshold 2. It might be called lactate turn point, Neers breakpoint 2. There's the list goes maximal lactate steady state, maximal metabolic steady state. The list goes on and on and on and on. The point is measuring your second threshold. The whole point of that is where you're trying to determine where exercise intensity goes from sustainable to unsustainable. So now we have our first threshold, our second threshold, and then our third threshold, or third aerobic threshold in a sense, would be VO2 max. VO2 max is the maximal rate of oxygen consumption that can be achieved during high-intensity exercise, and indicates essentially how well your pulmonary, cardiovascular, and muscular system can uptake, transport, and utilize oxygen. And that sets like the top end boundary of aerobic stuff. And then anything past that is really just like your sprint capacity. So I guess I just kind of disproved what I just said. It's more of that's more of four zones, because you have your zone that's below first threshold, your zone that's between threshold 1 and threshold 2, your zone that's between threshold 2 and VO2 max, and then your zone that is above that. And any other delineation or breakdown of that is just kind of some arbitrary, and it's not fully arbitrary because I think there's good reasoning behind it, but any breakdown is generally just trying to enhance the adaptations a little bit more by making those zones a little bit smaller, so you're not like so you're honing in on a precise adaptation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'd say too that I think it's so that coaches can speak to athletes, communicate workouts a little bit better. And so like if I think about using a 6-zone model in cycling, so we break the first zone into 2, with the bottom of it being recovery, because it's not really hard enough to really cause adaptation. And so we're trying to tell people like, okay, if we're trying to get these aerobic adaptations, it has to be close enough to that first threshold that we're stressing the system a bit, but not so hard that we're going into that next area where things start to transition.
Right.
Same thing with between LT1 and LT2. Again, it's like this gray area or this spectrum, right? And it's like, so at the bottom, like some of that stuff is happening, but it's still pretty aerobic. And then as you get closer, then it's getting more and more, less and less aerobic as you're approaching that second one, right? And so I do think that, yes, it's like we can't measure things down as precisely as it would lead us to believe, but it's a good way to communicate things better with an athlete.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I just think that people might get a little bit too hung up on like, oh, should I do a 7-zone system, a 5-zone system, a 3-zone system? Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is just delineate between different physiological adaptations that should be occurring at different exercise intensities. And then in keeping with kind of like the delineation point and making things a little bit more simplified, I think there are ways of actually estimating those areas with simple field tests or repeated workouts that you could actually do, on a weekly to a monthly basis in terms of your training. So let's start with like zone 2 estimation. And I think there's a couple ways that I think about this. So the first one that I generally like, but I think people can screw this up a little bit, is the is either nose breathing or the talk test.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm trying to think of like the best way to describe it, but what I've been told is that nose breathing, I think, is actually a little bit more effective than the talk test, because I think people fool themselves in terms of like, oh, I'm still talking even though it's like extremely arduous to be talking. But if you're breathing in and out your nose and you're not kind of straining, because there comes a point where there is a kind of internal need to want to breathe out your mouth.
Yeah.
That's where that second threshold, in my opinion, or that first threshold, excuse me, would really be. So you just have to be in tune, though. You can't force it. You can't just be like, okay, now I'm just going to start breathing way harder in and out my nose. It's like the first point where you get that need to breathe out your mouth, that would be where zone 2 would be.
Yeah.
It's a little hard. I don't know if I'm describing it 100%, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, and that's one that I've been a fan of, and it's comfortably breathing through your nose. And and yes, it might get like slightly labored, and when I say slightly labored, like, yeah, there might be a point where you're like, okay, now it's starting to get a little bit uncomfortable. But it's like as soon as you feel the need to open your mouth, like you're definitely beyond that point.
Yep.
And so I think that works great with most athletes. But if you've got like a deviated septum or like something going on, then like that's not going to be a great test for you.
Mm-hmm. I also think that people trick themselves into being like, oh, I'm still nose breathing. And like, even though it's like, no, you've gone way past the point of this exercise. It's comfortably nose breathing until the point that you want to breathe out your mouth. And then that is that transition point. You don't get any extra gold stars for like pushing that even further. It's the same thing with the talk test, because I have run with so many people who it's like, oh yeah, we're talking, but our talk is like, okay, blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, you're just constantly like spitting out what you want between like those heavy breaths.
Yeah.
And I would say that's way too far as well. So it's not quite how Dave and I are talking right now, but it's like talking, okay, next sentence, okay, next sentence. And then it's from there. That's kind of where I would determine it.
Yeah, and same thing. And it's like, for me, I think it's so valuable or powerful to ride with athletes a lot of times, or even like even if it's virtually, and you're doing like Zoom or something, and it's like, I'll be riding with athletes, and it's like we're riding right, and I'm like, okay, stop. I'm like, do you hear that? And they're like, I'm like, you're above it. You need to slow down.
Yeah. But I think though too, like a lot of people have this misconception that zone 2 work should be like hard, and the only way for it to actually give you adaptations and stuff is that it like feels hard afterwards, but it's not. Like it's to accumulate volume and accumulate very steady but little fatigue. That's kind of the point.
And now this will turn into another zone 2 episode, but it's like I think that's where a lot of the confusion is, and it's like, what is too easy, what is too hard, or how hard does it have to be? And it's like, depending on who you talk to or listen to, I think you get different things where it's like some people are saying, oh, it needs to be like right at LT1 the whole time. And so I think that's where people get it to that place where it's, and I might make the argument, because I think about this a lot, it's like, yeah, if you only have 60 minutes to 90 minutes to ride every day and you're trying to do zone 2 work, then yeah, you probably want it right there, like right on that threshold, right on the cusp. But if you're doing a 6-hour ride, if you start there, it's going to get pretty miserable,
Yeah, it's going to get awful. So I always err on the side of caution. I always err on the side of like, okay, well, if it feels like you want to start breathing out your mouth, if it feels like you're laboring too much, with your talking and stuff like that, then probably you're fine. So that's my opinion on it. And I want to do another zone 2 episode on that, of like, what is actually too hard, because I think I do think that people have a tendency to go too hard, and I've been doing a lot of research on this stuff. I'll hold off on explaining what I mean. But yeah, okay, so moving on to field tests for like for second threshold sort of stuff. I think, it's like if you have a well-rounded training program, you're most likely going to be doing some level of threshold work. And I think just doing that threshold work, or doing, and Dave, we've already talked about how, the 30-minute FTP may not be the best thing, but I think that using that 30 minutes, using that 20 minutes, using iterations of what feels sustainable to what doesn't feel sustainable is perfect in terms of a field test. You don't have to make it be like, oh, I'm going to ride for 30 minutes as hard as I possibly can, and that's what it is. It's, I'm going to every 2 weeks on Thursday do 30 minutes, and it's going to feel hard, and it's going to feel like if I continued to do that, I wouldn't really probably make it past an hour, but it's only going to be 30 minutes. So that's how I would judge where second threshold is actually occurring. Do you have any tips or something like that, how you would actually judge it?
So I've got lots of different ways that I might do this. We talked about it in another podcast, where if we're doing what we think is zone 4 work, which would be right on around that second threshold, and people's RPE starts to be too low and heart rate's also suggesting it's low, then we just bump it up 10 watts. Sometimes if I want to spot check somebody's threshold, I'll have them do 4 times 10 minute, tell them to cover up their power meter, cover up the computer, do 4 times 10 minutes, and I'll look at the third and fourth interval. And what I'll tell them is, you want to settle in to the point right where you're about to redline, just beneath it, like comfortably hard but sustainable, like using all these words to try to like get them to clue in.
Yeah.
And the reason I look at the third and fourth is usually people will go too hard 1 and 2, but then they start to like settle in on third and fourth. I have another workout that's 3 times 20 minutes, and it like each one gets a little bit harder. And then on the third one, they're supposed to just settle in at what feels like threshold. And the idea is that we're creating some fatigue, and like generally, like if people are too fresh, their RPE or their rate of perceived exertion is a little bit skewed. So we want to like calibrate that a little bit with a few efforts, and then the 20-minute effort might be close to it. So I think there's lots of ways, but I think that experienced athletes are pretty good at feeling what that threshold is. And so, I mean, there's been a study, I think, where athletes on a treadmill, like they could, when they were at RPE 7 on a 10-point scale, they were very close to maximal lactate steady state or the second threshold, you know? And so, yeah, I think you and I talked about it on the other podcast, or like calibrating your internal power meter or pace meter or whatever you want to call it, and like really getting a sense for what these things feel like. And I think if you continue to work on that, you'll start to know without having to look at it. And so whether we're talking about first threshold and that first steepening of breathing, stuff like that, or the second threshold where you start to get the burning in your legs and you're, you know, it's like, yeah, I think a few different ways there.
Yeah, and then I think the last one, you know, is there a field test for VO2 max or maximal heart rate or something along those lines? And I know we don't necessarily like the the idea of using max heart rate to dictate our zones, but I do think it's valuable to know kind of where your max heart rate is in a fresh state, in a trained state, in a overtrained state, other things like that. So something that you could use is just the 3 by 3 minutes, right? 3 by 5 minutes, those sort of things where it's a subjective, okay, you're going to go out and you're going to give your best effort for 3 minutes. You're going to rest for 3 minutes. Maybe it's 4 minutes, depending on if you're on a bike or not. But what you're looking for is towards the end of like the last two intervals, what your maximal heart rate is, because that's generally, once the system gets up to speed, how your physiology is responding at that point. That's going to be indicative of what your max heart rate is on that given day. And admittedly, for me, like there are days where my legs feel heavy and it feels like I can't even get my heart rate up that high, where there's other days where I'm like, I feel very recovered and it feels like I can get my max heart rate up pretty high. But I mean, all in all, it's like, what did we just describe to everybody? We just described a proper zone 2 workout. We just described a proper threshold workout, and we just described a proper VO2 max workout in a sense, in terms of defining and describing your zones. So if you're doing that and you're doing workouts that are kind of reflective of where each of those zones should be, you can iterate and you can dial up a little bit, you can dial back a little bit on a weekly basis, on a bi-weekly basis, whatever it is, however it fits into your schedule, and then you can get an idea of how things are changing over time. And I think if you don't have access to the physiological testing and other things like that, and repeated physiological testing especially, I think that this is a perfect way of being able to dynamically kind of shift your zones and get an idea of how your zones are changing without having to do like a crazy testing week every 6 weeks or so, because you're adding in those workouts, those check-ins, those other things like that every few weeks, and you're able to actually gauge, did I change? And I will say this, I would try to keep the workouts almost exactly the same, because then you're changing less variables and then you know actually how things are changing.
I have to laugh at that because I think it's such a good one. I think it's just something that's become an issue over the last 5 to 10 years, where it's like we have like all these smart trainers and all this variability, and like training is really entertaining and stuff like that. And I think people have lost sight of like doing the same workout over and over and over again so that you can actually see that progression, right? It's like if you started off 4 times 10 and the first time it was at 220 watts, and then over time, you're doing it at like 230 watts or 240 watts, or you're doing 4 times 15 or 4 times 20. Like you're seeing that progression, where if you're always doing like crazy variable workouts and it's never repeated the same workout twice, then you really don't know if things are changing.
Yep. Yeah, 100% agree. And I also will say start on the easier side of things, because the next time you do it, you can always go a little harder and you can always hone in on that RPE a little bit better. So keep that in mind as well. This is like, I think, I think apparently one of my mottos is just like, be conservative in terms of like how hard you're going. And I think because I have a tendency to get injured and other things like that. But you can say, okay, well, 220 for my 4x10 was actually way too easy. So next time try 230, or up at, up 10 watts, the last two intervals or something like that. It's all about iteration and redesigning and trying to figure those things out. But so I think that's, this is probably the shortest episode of Fast Physiology that we've had, in terms of I think that those are the 3 things that you could probably do, is just iterate, figuring out those zones, and then going from there. Dave, what are your big takeaways on this?
Yeah, I think if I had to have a takeaway, I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. And like you said, it's like really there's three zones. And we're just trying to like work within there like broadly so that we can try to target physiological adaptations. And so I think also something I'm like a big fan of is if you ever look at a pace curve or a power curve, there is like this human power time duration relationship where the shorter the duration, the harder you can go, the longer the duration, the less hard you can go. And so even that, if you want to do a VO2 workout, go 5 times 3 minutes, about as hard as you can for 5 times 3 minutes. And that's going to be right there at VO2. If you want to do a threshold workout, do 2 times 20 minutes, right around the time, like not a max effort. Think like 95 to 90% of the max effort.
About as hard as you can for that 20 minutes, right? You know, by 2, and just know you have to repeat it twice, right? Like that's the big
and
thing.
we're working that system because that's the system that's having to provide energy for that duration at that intensity.
Yep, it's all about specificity. I was going to say the exact same thing. Is just like I think in this world of technology and other things like that, we have a tendency to overcomplicate, the like training. So simplify your training to the extent that like you can do these field tests and get an idea. You can do these iterative workouts and get an idea of how things are changing, and I say simplify, but simple isn't easy. So keep that in mind because there's a difference between the two. So simple isn't easy. Don't overcomplicate your workouts. Try implementing those 3 field-based tests that we just talked about. Let us know, what do you use in terms of your field-based tests, to determine your zones. I know there's one that I've talked about a lot with uphill athlete. With a 5% change and stuff, which I also really like. But I've kind of talked about that till I've been blue in the face. So I think there's other ways of doing it. So comment down below if you have a different method of determining which zones. If you guys have any questions, you can always reach out to me on Instagram at Critical02. You can reach out to Dave at Kaizen Endurance, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions or help you out, or even highlight your questions on an episode of Fast Physiology. Also, don't forget to check out Dave's podcast, Training Babble. Him and I are doing this Fast Physiology series, and we are going every other episode essentially to the on our different respective podcasts. So go check out Dave's podcast. There's probably a bunch of stuff that you haven't seen or haven't heard about. So go check that out, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.